Dad left me alone to vacation with stepfamily, but now wants me to give a boost to my stepsister. All right, so let me tell you about how everything went downhill after my mom passed away. I was only 9 years old when it happened, and back then, it felt like everything in my life just stopped making sense. I mean, my mom was my whole world, you know? She was the one who made everything feel normal and safe. But when she passed, that safety kind of disappeared and everything changed. At first, I thought maybe my dad, Mike, he's 47 now, but back then he was in his mid 30s, would hold things together. I guess I just assumed that since he was my dad, he'd step up. Spoiler alert, he didn't. I mean, for a little while things were fine. It was just me and him, and we tried to find some kind of routine without mom. He'd take me to school, we'd have dinner together, and it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't terrible either. Then, about a year later, he started dating this woman, Jane. I didn't know much about her at first, except that she was younger than my dad, like 12 years younger, so she was 35. I remember the first time she came over to our house for dinner. She seemed nice enough, I guess, but looking back, I should have seen the warning signs from day one. Jane didn't waste any time moving in after they got serious. It wasn't long before she brought along her daughter, Betty, who was 17 at the time. And let me tell you, Betty was the definition of spoiled. From the minute they walked through the door, it was like they owned the place. Jane didn't even try to make me feel included. She just took over like she'd been running the show forever, and my dad, for some reason, just went along with it. Now, I was just a kid, 9 years old, and I was still grieving the loss of my mom, so I didn't really know how to deal with any of this. But I noticed pretty quickly that my dad started changing. He wasn't really my dad anymore. It was like Jane became the priority, and I don't even know how to describe it. Like I was there, but I wasn't important. Things started getting worse when it became clear that I wasn't treated like a kid in my own home. You'd think after losing my mom, my dad and Jane would have some level of sympathy or understanding, right? But nope. Instead, they started treating me more like the maid than a family member. Jane had this thing where she'd give Betty every bit of attention while I was the one stuck doing all the chores. I wasn't allowed to say anything either because apparently that was just how things worked now. It got to the point where I was cleaning up after Betty constantly. I mean, she was 17, but she acted like a toddler, leaving her mess everywhere, and it was always up to me to clean it up. Betty would be out with her friends or sitting around watching TV while I was stuck washing dishes, vacuuming, or doing whatever chore Jane threw my way. And my dad? He didn't do a damn thing to help. He acted like it was normal for his 9-year-old daughter to be treated like a housekeeper. I couldn't understand why he was okay with it, but at the same time, I didn't know how to speak up either. But you know what really did it for me? The Christmas trip. This part still makes my blood boil when I think about it. That Christmas, they all decided to go on a vacation together. My dad, Jane, and Betty. They were going somewhere nice. I think it was a cabin up in the mountains or something. I was excited at first because, I thought I was going too. It's Christmas, right? Family time and all that. But nope. I got told that I had to stay home and look after Betty's dog, Max. They actually made me stay behind to dog sit while they went off on this fancy vacation. Now let me be clear, I love dogs. Max was a good dog, but he wasn't my dog. He was Betty's dog. I tried to suggest that we take Max to a boarding place or hire a pet sitter, but Jane shut me down real quick. She said something about it being a waste of money and that I was perfectly capable of staying home alone for 3 days to look after him. I was freaking 9 years old, and they left me there, by myself, to take care of the house and the dog while they went off and had a great time. I remember sitting in the living room that first night feeling completely abandoned. I was scared, sad, and angry all at the same time. It was Christmas for crying out loud, and instead of being with my family, I was stuck at home, watching some hyperdog that wasn't even mine. It felt like my dad didn't care about me anymore, like I wasn't part of his new family. What hurt the most was knowing my dad was okay with all of this. He didn't fight for me, didn't make an effort to include me. He just went along with whatever Jane wanted, and what she wanted was for me to stay out of the picture. That Christmas marked a huge turning point for me. From that moment on, I started feeling more and more distant from my dad. He wasn't the same guy I used to look up to. He became someone who let Jane call the shots, and I was always the one getting the short end of the stick. Every holiday, every family event, it was always about Jane and Betty. I was just there in the background, expected to do what they wanted. Honestly, looking back, I wish I had spoken up more. But at 9, what was I supposed to do? I didn't have the words or the courage to stand up to my dad or Jane. I just took it, and that's probably why things kept getting worse over the years. But here's the thing. I wasn't completely alone. After that awful Christmas, my Aunt Sarah, who was my mom's sister, came over with my cousin Danny. They had heard what happened and made it their mission to make me feel better. They brought over Christmas presents, cooked a big dinner, and made it feel like a real holiday, even though it was after the fact. Danny even stayed over to help me take care of Max, even though she didn't have to. That's when I realized that my real family wasn't the people living under the same roof as me. It was the ones who actually cared about me. Aunt Sarah and Danny became my rock after that. They didn't need to step up, but they did. And that's something I'll never forget. If it wasn't for them, I don't know how I would have gotten through all those years of being treated like I didn't matter. That Christmas showed me who my real family was, and it sure wasn't my dad or Jane. All right, so let me tell you about how things played out after that whole Christmas mess. Like I said, after that holiday, I started pulling away from my dad. I mean, how could I not? It felt like he'd picked his side, and it wasn't mine. But there's more to this story. And honestly, the stuff that happened after just confirmed that I was never going to be treated like part of the family. First off, things with Jane didn't get any better. Actually, they got worse. She started getting more comfortable in her role as the queen of the house, which meant I had more responsibilities dumped on me. By the time I was 12, I was doing everything around the house: laundry, dishes, vacuuming, you name it. And every time I'd ask for some help, Jane would just smile and say, "It's good practice for when you have your own home one day." Like what? I was 12. I didn't even know how to cook for myself. But she expected me to keep the entire house spotless. Betty, on the other hand, was still the golden child. She was 17 when Jane and my dad got married. And let me tell you, she knew how to play her mom like a fiddle. Anytime Jane was about to ask her to do something around the house, Betty would magically come up with some excuse: homework, hanging out with friends, or some kind of important thing she had going on. And every time, Jane would just let it slide. Meanwhile, I'd be scrubbing the floors or cleaning up after their little family dinners. It's like they expected me to disappear into the background and just be their unpaid maid. But you know what really pissed me off? The way my dad just sat there and let it all happen. He'd be sitting in his chair watching TV while Jane barked orders at me like I was some kind of servant. He didn't say a word. Not once did he step in and say, "Hey, maybe you should help out too," to Betty or even Jane. I don't know if he was too scared to stand up to her or if he just didn't care. Either way, it hurt. One time when I was about 14, I actually tried to talk to him about it. I told him I didn't think it was fair that I was the only one doing all the work while Betty did nothing. And you know what he said? "Life's not always fair. You just have to deal with it." That was it. No empathy, no understanding. Just deal with it. After that conversation, I kind of gave up on expecting anything different from him. Now here's where Aunt Sarah and Danny come back into the picture. See, after that Christmas, they didn't just disappear from my life. They stuck around. Aunt Sarah would come over for birthdays, holidays, and even random weekends just to check in on me. Danny was always there too. Even though she was a few years older than me, we got super close. She was like the big sister I never had. We'd hang out at Aunt Sarah's place whenever I needed a break from Jane's constant nagging or Betty's messes. Danny would take me out for ice cream, we'd go shopping, or sometimes we'd just sit around and binge watch TV shows. She was the first person I felt like I could actually talk to about everything going on at home. She knew how crappy things were for me, and she never made me feel like I was being too dramatic or whatever. One weekend, when I was about 16, I was staying over at Aunt Sarah's, and Danny and I were talking about how things were at home. I remember telling her about how Jane had yelled at me for not folding the laundry fast enough that week. It was something so dumb, but it had really gotten to me. Danny just looked at me and said, "You know, this isn't normal, right? You're not supposed to be treated like this." That hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so many years thinking this was just how life was supposed to be that I hadn't even realized how messed up it all was. Danny and Aunt Sarah were always so kind to me, but it wasn't until that moment that I realized how different my life could be if I wasn't stuck in that house with Jane and my dad. It was like something clicked in my brain after that conversation. I stopped caring so much about pleasing Jane or even trying to get my dad to see my side. I started focusing more on school, hanging out with Danny, and just doing things for myself. I still did the chores because I had to, but I didn't let it get to me as much. I just kept my head down and told myself that one day I'd be out of there. And I was right. When I turned 18, I got accepted to college with a full scholarship. That was my ticket out, and I wasn't going to waste it. The day I left for school, Jane didn't even bother to say goodbye. She just gave me a half-hearted good luck and went back to whatever she was doing. Betty didn't care either. But my dad? He actually seemed sad. He hugged me for what felt like the first time in years and told me he was proud of me. It was weird. hearing that from him after everything. But at that point, it didn't mean much to me. I was too focused on the fact that I was finally getting away from that house. College was a whole different world for me. I got to start over, make new friends, and just live my life without feeling like a burden or a maid. Aunt Sarah and Danny were still my biggest supporters, sending me care packages and visiting whenever they could. And honestly, they were the only family I really cared about at that point. But of course, even though I was gone, Jane and Betty weren't done stirring up drama. About halfway through my first semester, I got a call from my dad. He told me that Jane and Betty had been talking, and they thought it would be a good idea if I came home for the holidays. He made it sound like this big olive branch, like they were finally ready to treat me like part of the family. But I wasn't buying it. I could hear Jane in the background, telling my dad what to say, and it was obvious she didn't care about me. She just wanted someone to come home and help with the holiday prep. I wasn't about to fall back into that trap, so I told him I was spending the holidays with Aunt Sarah and Danny, and that was that. He didn't argue. He just sighed and said, "Okay, maybe next time." Yeah, right. I knew there wouldn't be a next time. I was done with trying to make things work with my dad and Jane. They had their chance, and they blew it. I had my real family now. Aunt Sarah, Danny, and the life I was building for myself. So, after all that, I guess the takeaway is this. Sometimes the people you're born into a family with aren't the ones who end up being your real family. Sometimes it's the people who step up when no one else will, and that's exactly what Aunt Sarah and Danny did for me. All right, so now that I've told you how I got through all that mess with Jane and my dad, let's talk about what happened after I moved out for college. You'd think that after finally getting away from them, things would calm down, right? Well, not exactly. In fact, it feels like that's when the real drama kicked off. And of course, it all came back to one person, Betty. So I'm a couple years into college at this point, living my best life. I've got good friends, doing well in my classes, and for the first time, I'm really starting to feel like I have control over my own life. Aunt Sarah and Danny are still super supportive, and I'm visiting them whenever I can. But the whole family situation with my dad and Jane, I was basically keeping my distance. I figured if I just focused on school and stayed away, things would stay peaceful. But apparently Betty had other plans. One day I get this random message from her. Now let me just say, me and Betty never really talked. She was always doing her own thing. And like I said before, I was just the maid in her eyes. So when I saw her name pop up on my phone, I was like, what now? She starts off acting all friendly, like we've been best buds this whole time. She's asking me how college is, what I'm studying, all that fake small talk. And I'm just sitting there like, okay, what's she getting at? Because let's be real, Betty wasn't messaging me out of the goodness of her heart. Then she gets to the point. Turns out she's having some trouble with her own college stuff. And by trouble, I mean she failed a couple of classes and was struggling to stay in school. Of course, Betty being Betty, she wasn't taking any responsibility for it. She blamed it on her professors, on the unfair assignments, basically on everything but herself. And then she hits me with the real reason she's messaging. Hey, would you mind helping me out with my classes? Maybe write a couple of essays for me? I know you're really smart, and it would mean a lot. Yeah, you read that right. Betty wanted me to do her homework for her. After all those years of treating me like crap, ignoring me, and acting like I didn't exist, she suddenly needed my help. I honestly couldn't believe she had the nerve to even ask. So I sat there for a minute, thinking about how I should respond. Part of me wanted to just blow up on her, to let all those years of frustration come out, but I knew that wasn't worth it. Betty wasn't worth the energy. So instead, I kept it simple. I messaged back and said, "Sorry, Betty, I've got my own work to focus on. Good luck with your classes." That was it. I didn't owe her any explanation, and I wasn't about to get sucked into her mess. Of course, she didn't take that well. She tried to guilt trip me, saying stuff like, "I thought we were family," and "You're supposed to help your sister out when she's struggling." Sister? Since when did she consider me her sister? I wasn't about to let her manipulate me, so I just ignored the rest of her messages. But here's where things get interesting. After I turned Betty down, it wasn't long before I heard from Jane. She calls me up and I can already tell she's pissed. She starts going off about how I'm being selfish for not helping Betty and how I'm throwing away an opportunity to bond with my stepsister. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Like, really? After everything, they were still expecting me to bend over backward for them. I told Jane straight up that I wasn't going to do Betty's work for her, and if Betty was struggling, maybe she needed to take responsibility for once. Jane did not like that answer. She started ranting about how I owed it to the family to help out, how I should be grateful for everything they'd done for me. Grateful for what? For treating me like a servant for most of my childhood? For leaving me behind every time they went on vacation? I wasn't having it. I ended up cutting the conversation short and telling Jane I wasn't going to change my mind. I hung up before she could keep going, and honestly, I felt pretty damn good about it. For the first time, I was setting a boundary with them, and I wasn't backing down. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, my dad calls me. Now, I hadn't heard much from him since I'd moved out, so I was kind of surprised he was reaching out. He starts off trying to make small talk, asking how school is going and all that, but I knew where this was headed. Sure enough, after a few minutes, he brings up the whole Betty situation. He tries to play the peacemaker role, telling me that Jane's really upset and that maybe I should reconsider helping Betty out. He even threw in the classic family sticks together line, like that was supposed to change my mind. I couldn't help but laugh a little when he said that. I mean, where was all this family talk when I was the one being left behind? Where was this togetherness when I was the one cleaning up after everyone? I told him straight up that I wasn't going to be guilted into doing something that wasn't my responsibility. If Betty couldn't handle her own schoolwork, that was on her, not me. Dad didn't argue much after that. He just sighed and said, "I'm disappointed, but I understand." And that was the end of that conversation. I hung up feeling a weird mix of emotions, proud of myself for standing my ground, but also kind of sad that this was what my relationship with my dad had come to. I mean, deep down, I still wanted to have a real connection with him, but every time we talked, it felt like there was this huge wall between us. Anyway, after all that, I didn't hear from Betty or Jane for a while, which was honestly a relief. I focused on my classes, hung out with my friends, and just tried to keep moving forward with my life. I wasn't going to let their drama drag me down anymore. Then, a few weeks later, I got a call from Aunt Sarah. She'd heard about the whole situation with Betty and Jane, and she just wanted to check in on me. We ended up talking for hours, and she reminded me that I didn't owe anyone anything. "You've got your own life to live," she said. "Don't let them make you feel guilty for doing what's best for you." She was right, of course. And hearing it from her made me feel even more confident in my decision. I wasn't going to let my dad, Jane, or Betty make me feel bad for putting myself first for once. I had spent too many years being pushed around and overlooked, and now that I was finally starting to build something for myself, I wasn't about to give that up. So yeah, that's the story of how Betty tried to drag me back into the chaos and how I said no for the first time, and honestly, it felt pretty damn good. Alright, so here's where things really took a turn. I was doing my thing, focused on school, staying away from all the drama back home with Jane and Betty, and for a while, it seemed like they finally got the message to leave me alone. But of course, peace didn't last long. One day, out of nowhere, I get this email from my dad. It wasn't anything long or dramatic, just a quick note saying he and Jane wanted to talk. Right away, I knew something was up. I hadn't heard from them in months, so if they suddenly wanted to have a talk, it wasn't going to be good. Still, I figured I'd hear them out because despite everything, a small part of me still wanted to believe maybe they'd changed. Spoiler alert, they hadn't. So I agreed to meet up with them. We decided on this little coffee shop in my hometown, a neutral place where I could make a quick exit if things got bad. I walked in, and there they were, sitting at a table like nothing had ever happened. My dad looked tired, like older than I remembered, and Jane? Well, she looked the same, cold, detached, like she had somewhere better to be. After some awkward small talk, they finally got to the point. Jane, of course, was the one who spoke first. She always liked to control the conversation. "We've been talking about the future," she said, in that fake sweet voice she used when she was trying to sound reasonable. "And we think it's time for you to start thinking about your responsibilities." I was confused. "Responsibilities? What do you mean?" That's when she hit me with it. "Your father and I are getting older, and Betty, well, Betty is going to need some help getting settled in life." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't talking about my future. They were talking about Betty's future. And somehow, in their minds, I was supposed to play a role in making sure Betty was taken care of. You know, the same Betty who never lifted a finger to help me, who treated me like trash, who I hadn't spoken to in months because she only ever reached out when she needed something. "Wait, you want me to help Betty?" I asked, trying to keep my cool but already feeling the anger bubbling up. My dad finally spoke up then, his voice tired and resigned. "She's struggling, and we just thought that, as her sister, you'd want to help out. You're doing well for yourself, and we thought maybe you could, give her a little boost." Give her a boost? Was this a joke? They wanted me to financially support Betty now? The same Betty who couldn't even bother to message me unless she needed homework help? I felt like I was in some twisted alternate reality where everyone had lost their damn minds. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what they were asking. So, let me get this straight, I said, looking directly at Jane, because I knew she was the mastermind behind all this. You want me to take money that I'm earning from the life I've built for myself and just hand it over to Betty? Why? Because she can't get her life together? Jane didn't even blink. It's what family does. We help each other. And since you're doing well, we thought it would be fair for you to help your sister out. At that moment, something in me snapped. All those years of being treated like I didn't matter, like I was just there to serve them, came rushing back. I couldn't believe the audacity of what they were asking. I'm not doing it, I said, my voice firm. I'm not responsible for Betty's life. She's a grown woman, and if she can't figure things out, that's on her, not me. My dad tried to jump in, but I wasn't done. Do you even hear yourselves? After everything, you still expect me to just drop everything and fix Betty's problems? You never helped me when I needed it? You let me clean up after her, let me be the one who was always left behind. And now, when I finally have my own life, you want to drag me back into this mess? No. Jane's face hardened, and I knew what was coming next. She always had a way of flipping things to make me feel guilty. You're being selfish, she said, her voice cold. We've done so much for you, and this is how you repay us? By turning your back on your family? I couldn't help but laugh at that. You really think you've done so much for me? Leaving me behind on holidays, making me do all the work around the house while Betty got a free pass, never once treating me like I mattered? That's what you consider helping me? My dad looked down at his hands, not saying anything. Jane, though, wasn't backing down. We gave you a home, we raised you, and this is the thanks we get? You're going to regret this one day when you realize how much we did for you. At that point, I was done. I stood up, grabbed my stuff, and looked them both in the eye. I don't owe you anything, I said, my voice steady. I've built my life on my own without your help. If Betty needs support, then maybe it's time you step up and help her yourselves. But I'm not going to be a part of this. I walked out before they could say anything else, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt angry, but at the same time relieved. I had finally said everything I'd been holding in for years, and it felt good. I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their toxic cycle. I was done being the one who was always expected to sacrifice for everyone else. After that, I didn't hear from them for a while. No calls, no messages, nothing. And honestly, that was fine by me. I focused on my school, my friends, and the life I was building for myself. I knew that, no matter what, I had Aunt Sarah and Danny, and they were my real family. The ones who had actually been there for me, not just when it was convenient, but when it mattered. I guess the lesson in all this is, sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who has your back, and who treats you with respect. And Jane and my dad? They never did any of that. So yeah, I walked away from them and I don't regret it. So after all that mess with Jane and my dad, you'd think I'd finally get a break, right? I mean, I pretty much shut down their whole plan to get me to support Betty, and I walked out of that coffee shop thinking I was done with them for good. But nope, life wasn't about to let me off that easy. A few months after that whole confrontation, I was finally finishing up my last year of college. I had a decent job lined up after graduation, and things were going pretty well. Aunt Sarah and Danny were still my rocks, and I was feeling good about where my life was headed. I'd cut off all contact with Jane and Betty, and the distance from all that drama was honestly the best thing I could have done for myself. But just like clockwork, right when I thought everything was settling down, my dad decided to show up again. I was in the middle of studying for finals when I got a text from him. I hadn't heard from him since that awkward coffee shop meeting, so when I saw his name pop up, my first thought was, what now? The text wasn't long, just him asking if we could talk. No details, no explanation, just, hey, we need to talk. I debated ignoring it, but there was this little part of me that hoped maybe, just maybe, he wanted to apologize or something. So, like an idiot, I texted him back and agreed to meet. We ended up meeting at the same coffee shop as last time. I walked in, half expecting to see Jane sitting there with him, but she wasn't. It was just him, sitting alone, looking more worn down than I'd ever seen him. He had this look on his face that told me whatever he was about to say, it wasn't going to be good. We went through the usual awkward small talk, but I could tell he was nervous. Finally, after a few minutes, he just came out with it. Betty's in trouble, he said, his voice low. And I don't know what to do. I felt my stomach drop. Here we go again. What kind of trouble? I asked, already bracing myself for the ridiculousness that was sure to follow. She dropped out of school, he admitted, looking down at his coffee cup. She couldn't keep up with her classes, and she's, Well, she's been making some bad decisions. Now let me stop right here. When he said bad decisions, I knew exactly what he meant. Betty had always been the type to make dumb choices and then expect someone else to clean up the mess. And I had a feeling that this time, they were hoping that someone would be me. She's staying with us right now, Dad continued. But Jane and I, we can't keep bailing her out. She's racked up a lot of debt, and we're not sure how much longer we can keep helping her. I just stared at him, waiting for the punchline. I could already feel where this conversation was headed, but I wasn't about to make it easy for him. Okay, I said slowly, and what does that have to do with me? He looked up at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw actual desperation in his eyes. We were hoping you could help her out. You've got that new job lined up, and you're in a better position to give her a hand. There it was. The moment I had been dreading since the second I saw his name pop up on my phone. They wanted me to bail Betty out again. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my cool. Dad, I don't know how many times I have to say this, but I'm not responsible for Betty. She's made her choices, and if those choices have put her in a bad situation, that's on her. I've worked my ass off to get where I am, and I'm not about to throw that away to clean up her mess. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, staring into his coffee like he was trying to find the right words. Finally, he sighed and said, I understand, I really do, but she's your sister. That was it. That was the breaking point for me. I couldn't hold back anymore. She's not my sister, I snapped, louder than I meant to. She's never been my sister. From the minute Jane walked into our lives, you and her made it clear that Betty was the priority. I was never part of the family. I was the one cleaning up after her, the one left behind while you all went on vacations. And now you expect me to save her? No, absolutely not. He looked shocked, like he hadn't expected me to actually call him out like that. But I wasn't done. You and Jane made your choices too. You chose to put Betty first, to make her your priority, and I accepted that a long time ago. But now you're going to have to live with those choices. I'm not going to be your backup plan. If you want to help her, go ahead, but don't expect me to do it. The silence between us was heavy. I could see the hurt in his eyes, but I didn't feel bad about what I said. For once I was standing up for myself, and it felt damn good. Eventually he nodded, like he finally understood where I was coming from. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't realize how much we hurt you. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? An apology wasn't going to change anything, and at this point, I wasn't interested in fixing what was broken. I just wanted to move on with my life. We finished our coffees in silence, and when we left the shop, I knew that was probably the last time I'd ever really talked to him. It wasn't a clean break, but it was a break. I wasn't angry anymore, just done. Done with the guilt trips, the manipulation, the constant expectation that I was supposed to fix everything. After that, I graduated, started my new job, and kept moving forward. I still have Aunt Sarah and Danny, and they're all the family I need. Betty? I don't know what happened with her, and honestly, I don't care. She's made her choices, and now she has to deal with the consequences. As for my dad, I haven't heard from him since that day in the coffee shop. Maybe he's realized that I'm not going to be the safety net they thought I was. Or maybe he's too embarrassed to reach out. Either way, I'm at peace with it. And that's the story. I've learned that sometimes you have to walk away from the people who are supposed to be family if they're only causing you pain. It sucks, but it's necessary. At the end of the day, I know I made the right choice for me. So I'm a 33-year-old guy, and for the last 12 years, I've had zero contact with my dad's side of the family. This all started when my dad remarried, a big shift that happened when I was just about 10. Back then, my parents split because, well, they just weren't in love anymore. Even though I get it now, as a kid, it really shook me up. I felt a mix of shock and heartbreak, which led me to act out a lot. We even tried family counseling to smooth things out, but it mostly felt like only my mom was trying to get me. My dad? He was more about just dealing with things as they come, which made me feel pretty distant from him. I mostly lived with my mom and only stayed with my dad for short periods. Things took a harder turn when I was 15. My mom tragically passed away in an accident, and I had no choice but to move in with my dad full time. Honestly, those were some of the darkest days for me. It seemed like I was the only one who really missed her. My dad had been with his girlfriend, Emily, who's now 48, for a few years by then. They got engaged right around the time my mom died, which made things even tougher for me. It felt like my dad was moving on too fast, focusing on his new life with Emily and not showing any real sadness about losing mom. That left me feeling pretty alone during my teenage years. Living with Emily was no picnic either. She jumped right into trying to be the new mom in the house, setting rules and expecting me to fall in line. But how could someone just step in and act like they could replace my mom so quickly? It just didn't sit right with me. To make things even more complicated, Emily had a son, Mike, who's now 31. She was always trying to give him the upper hand, whether it was a better position on the football team or a bigger role in the school play. Sure, Mike wasn't totally cool with how his mom favored him. He'd even call her out on it. But he still enjoyed the perks of her efforts. My teen years were a mess of emotions, dealing with the loss of my mom, a dad who wouldn't stand up for me against Emily, and a stepbrother who was nice but kind of awkward around me. I decided early on that I just needed to keep my head down, get through college, and then I could start my own life on my terms. I ended up going to USC, which was great because it was still in my home state, and to save money, I stayed at home. Both my dad and Emily were cool with it, as long as I pitched in a bit for rent and groceries. It wasn't like I was freeloading. I was doing my part to help out while focusing on my studies. However, back then, I was completely blindsided by my dad, sitting me down one day and saying, "Son, we had agreed that you would stay with us during your college years, but something has come up. Emily and I feel like you're distracting Mike with your activities and friends that you bring over. And because of that, we need to come to a new agreement." When I heard this from him, I got really confused, not knowing the context. I thought he might have been referring to my friends that came over to play games on my WY every now and then. Or perhaps I was being too loud that night with music. I had no idea. And I asked him, "What do you mean, Dad? My friend's being a bad influence on Mike. I swear we haven't taught him anything wrong. And most of the time we stay out of each other's way, right?" He replied, "Yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about, OP. I think that you and I both know that Mike has strong feelings for Evelyn. What we were thinking is maybe you could break up with her to keep peace in the family. I mean, we don't think that a girl should mean more than your brother's well-being, right?" I laughed out loud when I heard this. It was by far the dumbest thing I had ever heard in my life. Still chuckling, I went, "Sure, Dad. Why don't I break up an amazing relationship? Because your kid doesn't know how to take no for an answer. I've already told him tons of times that he makes Evelyn uncomfortable, and I barely bring her over anymore. What is the problem anyways?" I knew he was beating around the bush, but I was starting to realize that Mike had gone all gung-ho with a "if I can't have a nobody can" attitude. And Emily had probably asked Dad to talk to me about it to appease her son and also make sure he doesn't waste any more time over this girl. I have no clue how they expected me to roll over on this, though. It blew up into a huge fight, and I ended up choosing to stick with Evelyn and move out of the house. I packed my bags one day and left, changing my cell number in the process to I crashed at a friend's place for a few days and eventually moved in with my girlfriend. Thankfully, I was in college on scholarship, and my main struggles came from paying for rent and utilities. But I hustled and work nights to make it happen. At this point, all bridges had been burned with my family, and the only people I consider family currently are a few relatives on my mom's side. It's been 12 years since then, and guess what? Evelyn and I got married, and both of us are quite comfortable in our jobs and lives. In fact, we bought our first house and are trying for a baby. I genuinely think leaving my toxic family behind was the best decision I made. However, a couple of days ago, someone showed up at my doorstep, and that made me spiral and think back to my past a little. Mike somehow found out where I lived and came over to visit one day saying that he needs to talk to me. I was too shocked to really react, and silently let him in after he made himself comfortable. We caught up a little, although he already knew the general gist of my life because he had apparently found out through social media. Then he told me the real reason he was here. He explained a lot of things about his infatuation with Evelyn, including his mom's involvement. However, he also added that he never wanted me to move out of the house, and that was something that Emily had devised all on her own. He said that his stepdad, a mom, seemed almost glad that I was gone, and the house became really cold and weird after that for him. The three of them ended up moving out of state a few months after I left, something which I wasn't aware of, and Mike didn't know how to reach out to me back then. In all this time, he had been feeling guilty for the way I had laughed and had gotten over his infatuation with Evelyn. Surprise? Surprise. But due to his shitty mental state had ended up mixing with the wrong crowd in college and ended up dropping out. The situation at home was terrible as well, and his mother was losing her mind over his lack of drive and success, without ever really bothering to find out why he was feeling so depressed. This eventually drove him to leave the house after 10 years back, and he's been wandering the states working random odd jobs and hitchhiking. He came to me to ask if I wouldn't help him out by settling in this town, perhaps by helping him get a foot in the door at the place I work at. For someone with no degree and no qualifications, this would be tough, and I made that clear. But Mike said that I owe him this for abandoning him without toxic family. He claims that even though we were distant, we were still brothers. He left about an hour back. As I'm writing this post and I'm torn, I don't think I owe him any obligation. But it's terrible to see him like this. I spoke to Evelyn about it and she would prefer staying. No contact with all members of my family, including Mike, but feels like we should help him out in some way. At least. Would I be the a-hole if I don't continue interacting with my stepbrother? Update 1. So after reading through all of your comments and thinking about this whole situation with Mike, I've kind of made up my mind on what to do next. I think the best plan right now is to help Mike get started on his own a bit. I'm going to give him some cash to cover a cheap apartment for a few months. That way he has a place to stay and some time to figure things out without stressing about where he's going to sleep each night. Plus, it's kind of like pushing him a little to stand on his own feet, because I'm also going to tell him he needs to start looking for a job on his own. It's time for him to take some responsibility, you know? I'm not really sure if Mike and I will ever have that close, brotherly bond. I mean, things have been pretty complicated between us, and maybe they always will be. But you guys made some really good points in your comments. I don't actually owe him anything when it comes to sorting out his own feelings and the stuff he's going through. It might sound a bit tough, but it's the truth. I did what I had to do for my own peace of mind and my own life. Giving him some help now is just me trying to be fair and give him a chance to get on his feet. So yeah, that's the plan. Help him out a little, but also make it clear that he's got to start pulling his own weight. Hopefully this helps him get started on a new chapter, and who knows? Maybe things between us will get better over time. But for now, I'm just focusing on doing the right thing without getting too caught up in all the emotional drama. Thanks for all your advice. It really helped me see things clearer. Update 2. Hey everyone, it's been a few months since I last filled you in on what's been going on with Mike and me. Well, a few months have passed, and I gotta say, Mike's really started to find his groove here in town. It's like he's a whole new person compared to who he was before. He's landed a job as a junior manager over at the local Walmart, which is pretty cool for him. The bit of money we gave him to help him get started has really done wonders. He's been using it wisely, and now he's even going to night school to get a degree. I'm really proud of him for taking these steps. It's kind of awesome to see him turning his life around and getting serious about his future. And honestly, watching his progress kind of makes me want to be more involved in his life, maybe help him out more or just be there for him. But there's still this one thing that's kind of bugging me. Even with all the positive changes, Mike still acts like I owe him something because I moved out earlier and he felt left on his own. Sometimes he even brings it up in a way that makes me feel guilty about the decisions I made. It's a bit frustrating because, I was just doing what I thought was best for me at the time. I talked to some of my relatives about this whole situation, and they think I should just face it head on and have a real talk with Mike about all these feelings. They think a good, honest confrontation might clear the air. I'm not usually the confrontational type, but maybe they're right. It might help get rid of this weird tension and help us move on, you know? So that's where I'm at right now. Thinking about sitting down with Mike, laying it all out, and hopefully sorting things out so we can both feel good about our relationship. It's not easy, but hey, that's family for you, right? Always a bit of drama, but also a lot of opportunities to grow closer if you handle things right. Thanks for sticking with me through this update, and I'll be sure to let you know how the talk goes. Update 3. I finally had that talk with Mike. It was about time I let him know why I think it's not cool for him to expect stuff from me just because of our past. But even though I had to lay down some hard truths, I've got to say, I really do think he's turned into a decent guy. He's changed a lot, and he definitely deserves some respect and, yeah, even some love from me. The chat was a bit intense, and it took Mike a bit to really get the whole picture. You know, understanding the subtle stuff, like why it's not okay to hold on to those old expectations. But he got there in the end. And you know what? He actually apologized. He said he was sorry for putting that unfair burden on me, and he even thanked me for all the help I've given him. That felt pretty good, not gonna lie. And there's more good news. Evelyn, yeah, she's had her issues with Mike too, especially because of some weird vibes he gave off in the past. Well, she's also coming around. Mike went to her, all on his own, and apologized privately for his past behavior. That took guts, and I really respect him for that. Evelyn softened up to him a lot since then, and it looks like things are finally starting to smooth out. So it looks like Mike's going to be welcome in our house from now on. It's a big step, and I'm kind of hopeful about where things are heading with him. As for his mom and my dad, that's a whole different story. Let's just say Mike and I are on the same page there. We both can't stand them, and that's putting it mildly. So yeah, they're not exactly on our favorite people list, and I doubt that's going to change anytime soon, lol. Anyway, that's the update for now. It's been a roller coaster, but it feels like things are moving in a better direction. Thanks for all the support and advice. It's really helped me handle this whole situation. I'll keep you all posted on how things go from here. Update 4. Just when I thought things with Mike were starting to smooth over, life decided to throw another complication our way. So yesterday was just another typical day at work for me. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual hustle. Midway through the afternoon, my phone rings. And it's Evelyn sounding more upset than I've heard in a long while. She tells me Mike came over to our house unexpectedly. Now we had an understanding with Mike that he needs to let us know beforehand if he wants to drop by. Common courtesy, right? But there he was, showing up without a heads up. Here's where it gets complicated. Mike didn't just come over for a casual visit to catch up or something lighthearted. After a bit of uneasy chit-chat, he starts into this intense confession. Turns out he's still got feelings for Evelyn. Yes, that's right. After everything that's gone down, this guy hasn't let go of his old crush. But that's not all. He goes on to ask Evelyn if she would consider giving him a chance, basically suggesting they could be something more. Evelyn, being the rock star that she is, shut that down immediately. She told him straight that it wasn't happening, that she was fully committed to our marriage, and that his feelings were completely inappropriate. But Mike didn't take the rejection well at all. He started arguing, getting visibly agitated, and even stepped towards her in a way that was way out of line. Thankfully, Evelyn managed to handle the situation and kicked him out before things could escalate. She even had the foresight to record the whole ordeal on her phone. When I heard about this, I left work right then and there, furious and ready to confront Mike. But by the time I got home, he had already left. I was absolutely livid, unable to think straight. After all the discussions, the efforts to rebuild some sort of trust and brotherly bond, it felt like we had just taken a massive step backward. Evelyn was understandably shaken by the ordeal, and I was left scrambling, trying to make sense of Mike's actions and figure out what our next move should be. Now I'm stuck wondering how to handle this whole mess. Do I confront Mike directly? Should we just cut ties completely this time? It seems like every attempt at mending our relationship ends up being undermined by another issue. And now, there's the added problem of his inappropriate behavior towards my wife. The whole situation is a mess, and honestly, I'm struggling to see a clear path forward. So, that's the update. It's yet another twist in the saga that's my relationship with my stepbrother. If anyone has any advice or has been through something similar, I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts because this is just more than I ever anticipated dealing with. Update 5. After the last incident with Mike, where he unexpectedly showed up at our house and confessed his feelings for Evelyn, which quickly escalated into a confrontational and uncomfortable situation, my initial reaction was anger. I mean, boiling point, seeing red type of anger. It was a lot to process, and in those first few hours, all I could think about was finding Mike and confronting him face to face, maybe even physically. I was that upset. I spent the better part of that evening driving around town, checking some of the usual spots I thought he might show up at, but Mike was nowhere to be found. It was like he had dropped off the face of the earth right after stirring up this storm in our lives. The more I couldn't find him, the more my frustration grew. It felt like he had just thrown a grenade into our lives and skipped town before the fallout. After several hours of this fruitless search, I came home to Evelyn. Seeing her so shaken up by what had happened and discussing it further helped snap me back to reality. I realized that trying to handle this through a physical confrontation wouldn't solve anything and could actually make things worse. Evelyn, ever the voice of reason, suggested we take a more constructive approach. We talked it through and agreed that the best course of action was to use the legal system to ensure our safety and set a firm boundary that Mike couldn't cross. She reminded me that we had the entire incident recorded on her phone, which captured not just his inappropriate confession, but also his aggressive behavior afterward. The next morning, with a clearer head and a heavy heart, I went to the police station to file a report. It was a tough decision, fraught with mixed emotions. On one hand, Mike was, at one point, someone I considered family, albeit a complicated and strained relationship. On the other hand, his actions had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. I handed over Evelyn's recording to the police, and they watched it intently, taking notes. The officers were quite supportive. They understood the severity of the situation and began the process to look into it right away. They mentioned that this evidence could potentially lead to a restraining order, depending on how things unfolded legally. Filing the police report felt like a necessary step towards reclaiming some sense of security, but it didn't come without its emotional toll. It marked a definitive end to any lingering hopes I might have had about reconciling with Mike. As I left the police station, there was a part of me that felt relieved. Relieved that we were taking concrete steps to protect ourselves and that the law was on our side. But there was also a profound sense of sadness, a recognition that the familial bond I once hoped to salvage was now beyond repair. The drive back home was a quiet one, with me just trying to process all the feelings swirling inside. Back at home, Evelyn and I had a long talk about everything that had happened. We discussed our next steps and how we would handle things moving forward. It was clear that our relationship with Mike had reached a point where the only interactions, if any, would be through legal channels. We were both on the same page about wanting no further contact with him unless absolutely necessary. The reality of cutting someone out of your life so completely, especially someone who was once considered family, is a stark and harsh one. Yet, for our own well-being, it felt like the only viable option left. These past few days since filing the report have been a bit of a waiting game. We're waiting to see how the legal process pans out, waiting to hear back from the police, and just generally waiting for some semblance of normalcy to return to our lives. This entire ordeal has taken a significant toll on both of us. There are moments of anger, moments of profound disappointment, and moments where the whole weight of this situation just feels overwhelming. Despite the turmoil, there have been some small silver linings. Evelyn and I have found a renewed strength in our relationship through dealing with this together. It's reminded us of the importance of supporting one another and standing united in the face of challenges. We've also been incredibly grateful for the support from friends and a few family members who are in the know about the situation. Their words of encouragement and offers of help have been a small beacon of light in what has otherwise been a very dark period. Update 6. After my last update, where I shared about filing a report against Mike following his unexpected and aggressive behavior, things progressed more rapidly than I expected. The police were quite efficient once they had all the evidence, including the recording from Evelyn's phone. They managed to track down Mike, and based on what had transpired, along with their own investigations, he was arrested. This wasn't an outcome I had ever hoped for, but his actions left us with no other choice, and part of me felt relieved that there was a measure of safety in knowing he couldn't just show up at our doorstep again. But barely had I started to process this, when another unexpected twist came our way. My phone rang one evening, and the display showed a name I hadn't seen in over a decade: my dad. The sight of his name stirred up a whirlpool of emotions, from old anger to a flicker of hopeful curiosity, wondering why, after all these years, he decided to call. I answered the call, a decision driven partly by those flickering hopes that maybe, just maybe, this could be a step towards some reconciliation or understanding. But those hopes were quickly dashed the moment I heard the tone of his and Emily's voices. There was no warmth or regret for the years of silence, no gentle easing into conversation. Instead, they dove straight into the issue at hand, as if the past 12 years of distance and silence had evaporated into thin air. They immediately launched into a tirade about how ridiculous it was for me to press charges against Mike, demanding that I drop them. Their words were forceful, insistent, as if they had any right to dictate my actions after everything that had happened. And as if that wasn't enough, they threw in an accusation against Evelyn, claiming she had somehow set Mike up, that she had manipulated the situation to make him look worse than he was. The accusation was not only baseless, but also deeply insulting. The shock of their audacity made my blood boil, but more than that, it brought back all the reasons why I had distanced myself from them in the first place. Here they were, after a 12-year hiatus, still trying to control and manipulate, still expecting me to bend to their will without question. It was as though they expected me to just fall back in line, like the old days when I didn't know any better than to follow their lead. I managed to keep my voice steady, though inside, I was a tumult of anger and disappointment. "So now you want to talk," I said, my words laced with disbelief and a cold anger. I didn't wait for their response. I told them never to contact me again, and ended the call before they could say another word. Hanging up on them felt like closing a door, a heavy, ironclad door, on a part of my life that had long caused me more pain than peace. It was a definitive move, one that said no more to manipulation, to emotional blackmail, and to relationships that brought more hurt than healing. Evelyn was right beside me, her presence a steady comfort. We talked it through, and she agreed wholeheartedly that we didn't need that kind of negativity in our lives, that our well-being and our peace were too important to compromise. The aftermath of that call left me with a lot to think about. I spent long hours into the night reflecting on what family means, on the bonds we choose to keep, and those we choose to sever. It's clear to me now more than ever that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about who stands by you, who supports you, and who respects your choices. It's about the people who are there for you in your darkest hours, who lend strength when you're weak, and who celebrate with you in your happiest moments. In the days since, as we wait to see how the legal proceedings against Mike unfold, I found a certain clarity. It's a clarity that comes from making tough decisions that prioritize our safety and mental health. It's not been easy, and there are moments when the weight of everything feels overwhelming. but there's also a sense of rightness in knowing we are taking steps to protect ourselves and to build a life surrounded by people who genuinely care. The support from friends and the few family members who have stood by us has been invaluable. Their words of encouragement and their presence, whether physical or through messages and calls, have helped buoy my spirits. It's reminded me that while we may have had to close the door on certain relationships, we've also opened the door to others, to people who have shown us what true family looks like. Update 7. Hey everyone, I've got quite the mix of updates to share with you today, and I'm starting with some really wonderful news amidst all the challenges we've been facing. Evelyn and I are expecting a baby. Finding out we're going to be parents has brought a bright new dimension of joy and anticipation into our lives that's hard to fully put into words. It's a profound moment for both of us, filled with hopes and dreams about the future we're going to provide for our child. This joyous news comes as a beacon of light, especially considering the tumultuous period we've been going through. It's like a promise of renewal and positivity when we've been surrounded by so much negativity. Planning for the arrival of our baby has given us a beautiful focus, a project filled with love and excitement, from discussing potential names to imagining what our little one will look like and planning the nursery. On the other end of the spectrum, we're still dealing with the ongoing legal situation involving Mike. The process has been slow and often draining. We recently met with our lawyer, who provided an update on what to expect going forward. Based on the evidence and charges, Mike could be facing between 5 to 7 years in prison. It's a heavy reality, one that carries a mix of emotions for us. Despite everything that has happened, there's no joy in seeing someone I once considered family facing such a harsh reality. It brings with it a somber reflection on how things escalated to this point and the series of choices that led us here. Throughout this legal maze, our focus has been on maintaining our integrity and ensuring our safety. We've been attending hearings and staying in close contact with our legal team to stay informed of every development. The gravity of the legal proceedings is a stark contrast to the lightness and joy we feel when focusing on our expected child. This duality of experiences has been a strange journey, preparing for a new life while simultaneously dealing with aspects of my past that I wish could have turned out differently. Evelyn has been incredible through it all. Her strength and resilience have buoyed me on the harder days, and her excitement about our baby is infectious. We've been spending a lot of time talking about how we want to raise our child. Values like kindness, understanding, and strength are at the forefront of these discussions. We want to create a nurturing environment, one that is vastly different from the tumult and strife that have characterized some of my familial relationships. As we prepare for our new arrival, we've also been consciously deciding to keep our distance from toxic relationships. The clarity that comes with expecting a child has reinforced our resolve to protect our family's peace. We've been rearranging our home, setting up a nursery, and reading all sorts of parenting books, each activity strengthening the bond between us and reinforcing the excitement for our family's future. Reflecting on family dynamics, I've come to appreciate even more the support from friends and the few family members who've been there for us. Their support has been a consistent reminder that family isn't just about blood relations, it's about who you choose to have in your life, who supports you, and who shares in your values. This network of chosen family has been instrumental in keeping us grounded and focused on what truly matters. Looking ahead, the arrival of our child feels like a new chapter, one where we can focus on creating positive memories and building a legacy of love and respect. It's a chance for us to turn the page on past difficulties and look forward to the joys of parenthood. Despite the ongoing legal situation with Mike, which we will continue to handle with the seriousness it deserves, we are increasingly looking forward to the future with optimism. Balancing the preparation for our baby with the legal procedures has not been easy. There are days when the stress seems overwhelming, when the slow pace of legal proceedings feels frustratingly at odds with the rapid preparations for our new arrival. Yet these challenges have also brought us closer together, solidifying our partnership and our commitment to our family's well-being. I'm deeply grateful for the community of friends, both online and in real life, who have offered words of encouragement and support through these times. Sharing this journey with you has provided not just a cathartic outlet for me, but has also offered perspectives and advice that have been invaluable. As we move forward, I'll continue to update you all on both the joyous and challenging aspects of our life. Your engagement and support have been pillars of strength for us, and I look forward to sharing more about our journey into parenthood and beyond. Here's to hoping that the next updates will be filled with more joy as we get closer to welcoming our new family member into the world. Thank you all for sticking with us through thick and thin. Your encouragement and insights have been bright spots in an often difficult journey. Last update. Firstly, the most wonderful news. Evelyn and I welcomed our beautiful baby into the world. The arrival of our child has been nothing short of miraculous, transforming our lives in ways we never could have imagined. Every cry, every smile, reaffirms our decision to focus on building a nurturing and loving environment away from past negativity. Seeing Evelyn embrace motherhood with such grace and love has only deepened my admiration and love for her. She's been incredible, and watching her with our baby makes every challenging moment we've endured together worth it. In parallel to the joy of new parenthood, the conclusion of Mike's trial has also been a significant part of our recent lives. After what felt like an eternity of hearings and waiting, the court handed down a sentence of 6 years. It's a substantial period that reflects the severity of his actions. On the day of the sentencing, I managed to have a brief conversation with Mike. I expressed my hope that he uses this time to genuinely reflect and perhaps find a new direction for his life. The exchange was brief and heavy with unspoken emotions: regret for the paths taken, sorrow for the familial bonds broken, and a somber acceptance of the reality we now face. This closure, though necessary, wasn't celebrated. It felt more like an acknowledgement that some chapters in our lives had to be closed, not with joy, but with a quiet resignation to protect our future and focus on the positives that we can control. It also marked a definitive end to any remnants of hope for reconciliation with Mike or my father and Emily. Their absence in all recent events only cemented our resolve that distancing ourselves was the right choice. Reflecting on this, the concept of family has profoundly shifted for me. I've learned that family isn't always defined by blood, but by the bonds you choose to nurture and the commitment to support each other through life's trials and celebrations. Evelyn and I have felt this shift acutely, deciding to invest our energies into relationships that bring positivity and growth, both for ourselves and for our child. Our baby's future is what drives us now. We've been imagining all the firsts we're going to experience: first steps, first words, first birthdays. We're planning the kind of upbringing we want our child to have, emphasizing kindness, respect, understanding, and above all, love. We hope to instill values that encourage our child to embrace diversity, seek understanding, and act with compassion towards others. As we adjust to our new roles as parents, our home has become a sanctuary filled with love and laughter, even amidst the sleepless nights and the steep learning curve that parenthood inevitably brings. We've transformed one of the rooms into a vibrant nursery, picking out colors and themes that we hope will inspire creativity and happiness in our child. Each choice, from the books on the shelf to the toys in the crib, has been made with so much thought and anticipation. Moreover, our discussions often turn towards how we will discuss our past with our child when the time comes. We agree that honesty, framed in a way that is age-appropriate and constructive, will be our guiding principle. We want our child to learn from our experiences, to understand the complexities of human relationships, and to know that while life can sometimes be challenging, there is always a path toward healing and happiness. During this transitional time, the support from our community, both locally and online, has been incredibly uplifting. Your comments, stories, and words of advice have not only helped us navigate the tougher times, but have also celebrated our victories with us. This virtual diary has become more than just a series of posts. It's been a shared journey that has connected us with so many wonderful people. Looking forward, while I may not update this specific thread anymore, the journey certainly doesn't end here. We're just beginning this incredible adventure of raising our child, discovering the world anew through their eyes. I hope to continue sharing parts of our life in other ways, perhaps focusing more on the joys and challenges of parenting and less on the conflicts of the past. In closing this chapter, I want to express my deepest thanks to all of you. You've been with us through some of the most difficult and the most beautiful moments of our lives. Your engagement has not just been a source of comfort, it's been a beacon of hope, reminding us of the goodness and support that exists in the world. Here's to new beginnings, to the adventures that await, and to all of you. Thank you for being a part of our journey. Your support has meant the world to us, and we look forward to sharing the next chapters of our lives with you, filled with as much hope and happiness as we feel now. Parents kicked me out on my birthday, then tried to take over my new home, but I had the last word. So, my 18th birthday. It should have been a big deal, right? Like a milestone or whatever. I was expecting at least a small family dinner, maybe some cake. Just a chance to relax, you know? But nah, things went the opposite way, and it still feels unreal. I had zero clue what was about to happen when I woke up that morning. I remember walking into the kitchen, the smell of coffee hitting me like every other day. My dad was sitting at the table with this serious look on his face. But it wasn't the "you messed up" kind of serious, more like he was getting ready to deliver some big news. My mom was standing near the sink, her back to me, pretending to wash dishes, but I could tell she was just avoiding eye contact. I was like, hey, what's going on? Trying to read the room. And then my dad just says, Steve, you're 18 now. Time to be on your own. That was it. Flat and cold, like he was telling me the weather. I just stood there, kind of shocked, waiting for him to laugh or something, like it was a joke. But no, he was dead serious. I asked, wait, what do you mean? And he goes, you're an adult. It's time for you to leave and figure things out. I looked over at my mom, hoping she'd say something, anything, but she just kept her back turned, scrubbing the same plate over and over. At that moment, it felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I mean, I get it, people move out at 18, but this was like a total surprise. No heads up, no discussion about plans or saving money, nothing. And it wasn't like we were struggling financially. They could easily afford to keep me there while I figured out my next steps. But nope, I was expected to pack up and get out right then and there. So I asked, where am I supposed to go? And my dad just shrugs like it wasn't his problem anymore. Figure it out, Steve. You're an adult. My head was spinning. It felt like one of those moments where everything's moving in slow motion and you're just stuck. Trying to process it all, I didn't even know where to start. I was like, wait, am I in trouble? Did I do something? And he just repeated, it's time to grow up. It's funny because up until that point, I thought I had a pretty okay relationship with them. Sure, we had our arguments, but nothing that seemed like a get out and don't come back kind of thing. So I started asking, is this about me not going to college right away? I told you I needed time to figure things out. But my dad just waved me off, saying, you've been freeloading for long enough. It's time to go. I felt my face get hot, that kind of anger that makes your hands shake, but there was nothing I could say to change his mind. I stood there for what felt like forever, hoping my mom would jump in. But she stayed silent, acting like I wasn't even there. That hurt more than anything my dad said. It was like she had already checked out of caring about me. Finally, I just gave up arguing. What was the point? I went to my room, grabbed the biggest duffel bag I could find, and started shoving my stuff in. Clothes, some books, my laptop, anything I thought I'd need. It was all happening so fast, and I felt this tightness in my chest, like I couldn't breathe. The walls of my room felt like they were closing in, like this place I'd called home for so long was suddenly suffocating me. I remember looking around my room, at all the posters and random stuff I'd collected over the years. It was like watching my childhood get packed away in minutes. The room felt empty and cold when I was done, and it hit me that this was it. I wasn't going to be coming back. When I came back out with my duffel bag, my dad didn't even look up from his coffee. My mom finally turned around, but she just looked past me, like I was some stranger passing through. I tried one last time. Are you really just going to kick me out like this? She finally spoke, but her voice was so cold. It's for your own good, Steve. I didn't know what to say. It felt like everything was happening to someone else, like I was watching my life from the outside. I walked out of the house, my bag slung over my shoulder, feeling the weight of every step. I stood on the driveway for a minute, just staring at the house, hoping maybe they'd change their minds, but the door stayed closed. They didn't even bother to come out and say goodbye. As I walked down the street, I felt lost. I didn't have a plan, no idea where I was going to go. I started calling friends one by one, hoping someone would let me crash for the night. A couple of them were cool with it at first, but you could tell they were hesitating, like they didn't want to get too involved. I guess I can't blame them. Who wants a couch surfer showing up with no end date in sight? I ended up at my buddy Mark's place. He and his roommate were chill enough to let me crash for a few days. I remember lying on his couch that first night, staring up at the ceiling, feeling this weird mix of anger and confusion. Like, how did it go from a regular morning to being homeless in a matter of hours? It's crazy because I kept thinking it was some kind of mistake or test, like they were waiting for me to figure something out and come back. But the more time passed, the more I realized they were serious. They didn't want me there. It was like this punch in the gut, realizing your own family doesn't have your back. The first few nights weren't too bad. Mark and his roommate were cool, and we'd stay up late, playing video games and joking around. But after a while, I could tell they were getting tired of having me there. And honestly, I was starting to feel like a burden too. There's only so many times you can hear, "Hey man, any luck with finding a place?" before it starts to sting. So, after about a week, I packed up my stuff and moved on to another friend's place. After a few weeks of bouncing from couch to couch, it started becoming clear that I was running out of places to go. Friends that I thought would have my back started making excuses like, "Hey man, my roommate's getting annoyed," or "My girlfriend's coming over a lot and it's getting crowded." It wasn't like they were being jerks or anything, I get it. No one signs up for a long-term couch guest, and the longer I stayed, the more I could see it in their eyes. They were itching for me to move on, even if they didn't say it directly. But once the couches dried up, that's when things got real. I didn't have enough money for a motel, and sleeping in my car became the new normal. I tried to make the best of it. I set up my back seat like a cramped little bed, threw in some blankets and a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but it was all I had. I parked in quiet spots, like behind gyms or in the corners of supermarket parking lots, hoping to avoid getting noticed. You never realize how loud parking lots are until you're trying to sleep in one. People coming and going, headlights flashing through the windows. Every noise had me on edge. The first few nights, I barely slept. My body would ache from being crammed in such a small space, and every noise outside made me jump. I'd wake up to security guards knocking on my window, telling me to move along. It's humiliating when you have to pack up and drive off, pretending like it's no big deal when really, you're just trying to find another spot to crash. I tried to make a routine out of it. I'd park at a 24-hour gym, using my membership to sneak in for showers and bathrooms. It felt like my only luxury, a hot shower. It kept me feeling human when everything else was slipping away. I kept a backpack with my essentials, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and some snacks. It was weird having my life reduced to such a small amount of stuff. During the day, I'd spend hours in my car, applying for jobs on my phone wherever I could find free Wi-Fi. It felt like I was throwing resumes into a black hole. I'd get the occasional, "We'll keep your application on file," but nothing concrete. I started applying to places I never imagined working at. Fast food chains, call centers, gas stations. At that point, I would have taken anything. One night, I thought maybe my family would have come around. It had been weeks, and I figured maybe they'd check in, see if I was okay. I decided to call my mom again. I didn't expect much, but I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd have a change of heart. When she picked up, her voice was flat, like I was a stranger. "Hey Mom, it's me, just checking in." She didn't even ask how I was doing. It was just, "What do you need, Steve?" That stung. It was like every bit of hope I had got sucked out in that moment, but I tried to keep it cool. "I was wondering if there's any chance I could stay with you guys for a bit, just till I get back on my feet." She didn't hesitate. "We already talked about this. We can't have you freeloading, Steve. You need to figure this out." The way she said it, so cold and detached, made my stomach drop. I felt like I was begging, and she was just shutting me down like I was some random guy asking for money on the street. I tried again, desperate. "I'm not asking for much, Mom. Just a couch. I'll pay rent once I start making money. I'm just stuck right now." There was a long pause, and for a second, I thought maybe she was considering it. But when she spoke again, it was just the same. "We all have our responsibilities. You're an adult now, and it's time to act like it." I hung up. I didn't even say goodbye. It was like a final slap in the face, knowing that my own mom didn't care if I was struggling. It felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at my phone, watching the screen fade to black, realizing that I was completely and totally alone in this. After that call, something shifted. I stopped reaching out to people. It felt like every time I did, it just reminded me of how alone I really was. So I kept my head down and tried to survive the best way I could. I started parking in different places every night, trying not to stick out. The last thing I needed was for someone to recognize me and start asking questions. I didn't want anyone knowing how bad things had gotten. I was spending a lot of time in public libraries during the day, using their Wi-Fi and charging my phone. I'd sit at the same spot near the back, my duffel bag at my feet, pretending like I was just another person studying or reading. But inside, I felt this constant tension, like at any moment, someone was going to look at me and know I didn't belong. There's this weird thing about being homeless. Everything feels like a fight to keep your dignity. You don't want people to know you're struggling, but at the same time, you're doing everything you can just to get by. I remember this one night, parked behind a supermarket. It was late and I was trying to fall asleep when a cop knocked on my window. I jolted awake, heart pounding. I rolled down the window trying to act like everything was normal. "What are you doing here?" he asked, shining his flashlight inside. I tried to explain, but the look on his face said it all. He didn't care about my story. "You can't stay here, man. Move along." I nodded, trying not to sound bitter. "Yeah, sorry. I'll move." As I started my car and pulled out of the lot, I felt that familiar mix of anger and shame bubbling up again. It felt like no matter where I went, I was a problem. I drove around for an hour, aimlessly, trying to find another spot. I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour fast food place, and that became my new spot for the night. I watched people go through the drive-thru, laughing and talking, while I huddled in the back of my car trying to get some rest. It felt like there was this whole world moving on without me, and I was stuck on the outside, watching. Eventually, I learned how to blend in better. I'd park in different spots every night and get up early enough to move before anyone noticed. I became good at finding the quiet places, those hidden corners of lots where no one really cared. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was temporary, that any minute someone would come knocking again, telling me to move on. Every day was about finding the next spot, the next place to rest. It was this cycle of packing up, driving, unpacking, and repeating it all over again. I started feeling like I was in survival mode all the time, like I couldn't let my guard down, not even for a second. There were days when I'd sit in my car, staring at my phone, wondering if I should call anyone, my family, friends, even my brother. But I knew how those calls would go. I knew they'd either laugh or tell me to man up. So I just stopped trying. It felt like every time I reached out, I was proving them right, proving that I was the screw up they thought I was. But through all of it, I kept applying for jobs, kept trying to find a way out. I didn't want to stay stuck in that car forever. I was determined to find something, even if it was just a tiny chance to pull myself out of the mess I was in. But man, it was a lonely fight. Living out of my car wasn't easy, but after a while, I got into a rhythm. I figured out where to park, what time to move, and how to stay invisible. It was all about survival, just keeping my head down and pushing through. But man, even with all that, there were days where I felt like I was just going in circles. I spent a lot of my days at a 24-hour gym. I had this cheap membership that let me shower and keep myself somewhat clean. It was one of the only places where I didn't feel completely out of place. I'd go there, clean up, and then sit in my car, applying for any job I could find. It was like a full-time hustle, and it felt like for every 10 applications I sent out, maybe one would get a response. And those responses were usually the same. We appreciate your interest, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates. I was starting to feel like maybe this was it, that I'd just be stuck like this. But then, one day, I finally caught a break. A retail store called me for an interview. I remember getting that call and feeling this mix of hope and nerves. It wasn't a dream job by any means, but at that point, anything was better than nothing. I showed up to the interview wearing the best clothes I had, which was basically the cleanest shirt from my car and some jeans that were starting to fray at the ends. I walked in, trying to act like I had everything together, but inside, I was a mess. I was thinking, please, just give me a chance. The manager, this guy named Tony, seemed chill enough. We talked for a bit, and he asked the usual questions. Availability, experience, stuff like that. I tried to stay confident, like I had it all figured out, but I could tell he saw through it a bit. Then he asked, "Do you have reliable transportation?" I hesitated for a second, thinking about how I basically lived in my car, but I just nodded. "Yeah, I've got a car." I left out the part where it was my makeshift home. Tony stared at me for a moment like he was sizing me up. Then he said, "All right, you're hired. It's minimum wage and you'll start next week." Man, I can't even describe the relief I felt. It wasn't much, but it was something. It felt like I finally had a shot to get out of the mess I was in. That night, for the first time in a while, I actually felt hopeful. I parked my car in my usual spot, and instead of feeling defeated, I was thinking about how I was going to make this work. The first few weeks at the retail job were rough. It was long hours, mostly on my feet, dealing with customers and stocking shelves. But I didn't mind. I threw myself into it, working every shift they offered. I'd show up early, stay late, and basically just try to make myself useful. Tony noticed. He'd give me a nod every now and then, and sometimes he'd tell me, "Good job, Steve." It wasn't much, but it felt like someone actually saw the effort I was putting in. With the job came paychecks, and with paychecks came a bit of stability. I wasn't rolling in cash or anything, but I could finally afford to buy food without having to count every dollar. I started saving whatever I could, even if it was just a few bucks at a time. My car still doubled as my bed, but at least I didn't have to worry about starving. I'd make little meals from whatever I could get cheap at the store. Bread, canned stuff, nothing fancy, but it worked. After a couple of months, I was even able to scrape together enough to split a cheap condo with a guy named Mike. He was looking for a roommate, and honestly, I was just grateful for a place with 4 walls and a roof. We weren't best friends or anything, but he was chill enough. We agreed to split the rent and utilities right down the middle, and that was that. Moving into that condo felt like a victory. For the first time in months, I had a bed, a real one, and a kitchen to cook in. I remember the first night I stayed there, just lying on that bed, staring up at the ceiling, feeling like I'd finally caught a break. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it felt like I was finally clawing my way out of the hole I'd been stuck in for so long. But life has a way of knocking you down just when you start to feel steady. A few months in, the pandemic hit, and everything went sideways. The store I worked at shut down temporarily, And like dominoes, my little setup started falling apart. At first, I thought it'd be a short-term thing, like we'd close for a couple of weeks and then get back to normal. But it didn't take long before it was clear that wasn't going to happen. I got the call one afternoon. Tony was on the other end, and his voice was strained. "Hey, Steve, I'm sorry, but we've got to let you go. We're not sure when we'll reopen." I tried to stay calm, but inside, I felt everything crumbling again. I thanked him for the opportunity, but the minute I hung up, I just sat there, staring at my phone, wondering what the hell I was going to do now. My roommate Mike was in the same boat. He lost his job too, and without either of us making money, the rent became impossible to keep up with. We stretched it as far as we could, pooling whatever savings we had, but eventually it wasn't enough. We had to break the lease, and just like that, I was back to square one. Packing my stuff into my car again felt like some cruel joke. It was like life was taunting me, saying, "Nice try, but not quite." I didn't have many options left, so I rigged up the back of my car with some old blankets, turning it into a camper setup. It wasn't great, but at least it was mine. I drove around looking for a spot where I could stay without getting hassled and found this old lot behind a strip mall. It was quiet enough, and no one seemed to care that I was there. I sat in my makeshift camper, looking out the window at the empty lot, and felt this wave of frustration. It felt like every step forward came with 2 steps back. But I tried to remind myself that I'd been here before, and I'd gotten through it. I knew how to hustle, how to survive. I just had to do it all over again. There were nights where I'd lay there staring at the ceiling of my car, feeling the weight of it all. It's hard to stay hopeful when everything feels temporary, like you're one step away from losing it all again. But at the same time, I knew I had no choice but to keep pushing forward. I'd done it once, and I'd have to do it again. The days started to blur together. I'd wake up early, head to the gym for a shower, and then spend hours looking for work online. I applied for everything: warehouses, grocery stores, delivery gigs, anything that would get me back on my feet. The stress was constant, but I kept telling myself, you just need one chance, one job to get things moving again. Some nights, I'd pull up to the same fast food place and park in the corner of the lot, watching the cars go through the drive-thru, headlights cutting through the darkness. It felt like the world was still moving while I was stuck in place, waiting for something to give. But as rough as it was, I refused to let myself give up. I'd made it through before, and somehow, I was gonna do it again. Living in my car again felt like hitting the reset button, but this time with an even bigger challenge. I had been through this once already, so I knew the drill, but there was this constant weight on my shoulders. It's like, yeah, I knew what to do, but man, it felt 10 times harder to get back up when everything was closing down around me. Everywhere I looked, businesses were shutting their doors, and the job market was tighter than ever. I kept applying for anything I could find, but it was getting bleak. Weeks went by, and every day felt the same. Sending out resumes, checking my phone, and seeing nothing but rejections or worse, no replies at all. I started to wonder if I was ever going to catch a break again. I knew I couldn't stay stuck like this, but without an income, it felt like I was trapped in a loop. But then, one morning, I got a call. It was from this warehouse I'd applied to weeks ago. Honestly, I'd almost forgotten about it because I sent out so many applications. The guy on the phone sounded straightforward. "Steve, we've got an opening. It's long hours, but if you're available, you can start next Monday." I remember sitting there in my car, gripping the phone, trying not to sound too desperate as I agreed. I could barely believe it. Finally, a break. The warehouse was about 30 minutes away from where I'd been parking my car, and I was ready to do whatever it took to make it work. The day before my shift, I drove over there to check out the area, and I parked my car in a lot nearby, figuring I'd sleep there for the night. It wasn't the best spot, but I wanted to be close enough to make sure I got there on time. When I showed up for the first shift, I was nervous. It was one of those massive warehouses with rows and rows of boxes, pallets stacked high. I walked in, and it was loud, forklifts buzzing around, people shouting instructions. I felt a bit out of place at first, but I told myself to just focus on getting through the day. My boss, Mr. Thompson, was this older guy, gruff but fair. He gave me the rundown, showing me what needed to be done: moving boxes, sorting inventory, loading trucks. It was physically demanding, but that didn't bother me. I was just grateful to be working again. I pushed myself hard that first day, lifting everything I could, moving as fast as possible, just trying to show that I wasn't some lazy guy off the street. After my shift, I went up to Mr. Thompson, and I figured I'd ask a favor. "Hey, I know this is kind of a weird request, but is it okay if I park my car in the lot here, just until I get things figured out?" I expected him to say no, but he paused, studying me for a second. You planning on sticking around, Steve? He asked, and I nodded. Absolutely. I'm here to work. He scratched his head for a moment, then nodded back. All right, just make sure you're not in anyone's way, and you can hook up to the outlet over there if you need power. I felt this wave of relief. It might have been a small thing for him, but for me, it was huge. Being able to park without worrying about getting kicked out was like a weight lifting off my chest. That night, I pulled my car into a corner of the lot and plugged in, setting up my little camper space. Having lights and a bit of heat felt like a luxury. For the first time in a while, I didn't have to worry about someone banging on my window, telling me to move. I lay down in the back of my car, staring up at the roof, feeling a bit of hope creeping back in. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small step forward. The next few weeks were a grind. The warehouse job was tough, long shifts, heavy lifting, and sometimes we'd be there until late at night. But I showed up early every day, making sure I was ready for anything they needed. Mr. Thompson noticed. He'd nod at me, sometimes giving me a thumbs up when I finished a task. It wasn't like we were buddies or anything, but I could tell he respected hard work. I started saving again. This time I was smarter about it. Every paycheck, I'd set aside as much as I could. I cut back on everything, eating the cheapest stuff I could find, skipping meals when I had to. It was all about building up a safety net so I wouldn't have to live in my car forever. I knew it wasn't going to be an overnight thing, but I kept my head down and focused. One day, after a long shift, Mr. Thompson pulled me aside. I thought maybe I'd messed something up, but instead he said, "You've been putting in the effort, Steve. We've got an opening for a night supervisor. You interested?" My heart was pounding. A supervisor role? That meant more money, more stability. I nodded so fast I probably looked desperate, but I didn't care. Yes, absolutely, I said. The promotion was a game changer. It wasn't a huge raise, but it was enough that I could start thinking about the future. I started looking online for cheap apartments or even small manufactured homes. It felt good to have options again, to feel like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. As the weeks went by, I got better at the job. I learned how to manage shipments, oversee other workers, and make sure everything ran smoothly. It felt good to have responsibility, like I was proving to myself that I could handle more. And the best part? I was getting closer to my goal. Every dollar saved was one step closer to getting out of my car for good. I remember this one night, after a long shift. I was sitting in my car looking up places online, and I found this manufactured home that was within my budget. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and it was in a quiet park, not too far from the warehouse. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It felt like I was finally getting a glimpse of a life that wasn't just about scraping by. I saved the listing and told myself, just a few more months of grinding and this could be yours. It was the first time in ages that I felt like I was actually building something, not just surviving day to day. I lay back in my car that night, feeling this mix of exhaustion and excitement. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. The days blurred into weeks, and I kept my routine. Early mornings, late nights, working as hard as I could. Mr. Thompson kept giving me more responsibilities, and with every shift, I felt a bit more secure. It was like, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just reacting to everything falling apart. I was actually in control, and it felt good. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Living out of my car was still rough. There were nights when the cold crept in, and no amount of blankets could keep me warm enough. But I held on to the thought of that manufactured home, of finally having a place that was mine, where I wouldn't have to worry about being kicked out or moving on. That hope was enough to keep me going. So that's where I was, working, saving, and slowly, bit by bit, building something for myself. It wasn't easy, but I knew I was on the right track. After months of grinding and saving, things were finally looking up. I'd saved enough to seriously consider getting that manufactured home I'd been eyeing. I remember driving past it a few times, just to get a feel for the neighborhood. It was a quiet spot, surrounded by trees and tucked away from the main road. Felt like the kind of place where I could actually breathe for once. It was far from fancy, but to me, it was perfect. One afternoon, I called the real estate agent listed on the sign. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if they ran a credit check and saw my terrible history? What if someone else already put an offer down? But I pushed those thoughts aside and waited as the phone rang. The agent was this cheerful guy named Pete. He asked a few basic questions, and I tried my best to sound confident, like I wasn't living out of my car and just barely making it. We set up a time for me to come check out the place. When I hung up, I felt this weird mix of nerves and excitement. This could be my shot at turning things around for good, but it also felt like everything was riding on it. The day of the viewing, I pulled up to the home early, parked my car around the corner, and tried to make myself look presentable. I had one decent button-up shirt left, and I hoped it would be enough. Pete was already there when I walked up, a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and started showing me around. Inside, it was simple: a small kitchen, a living room, and 3 bedrooms. The walls were plain, and the floors were a bit scuffed up, but it felt right. I could already picture myself fixing it up, making it mine. Pete talked about how it was a good starter home, how the previous owner had kept it in decent shape, and how it was a great opportunity for someone looking to build a future. I nodded along, trying not to let on how badly I wanted this to work. After the tour, he asked if I was interested in putting down an offer. I told him I was, and we sat down at the tiny kitchen table to go through the paperwork. My hands were still a bit shaky, but I tried to keep my voice steady as I filled everything out. We talked numbers, and when he mentioned the down payment, I felt a bit of relief. I had saved enough, but just barely. The next few days were tense. Pete said it would take some time for the paperwork to go through, and he'd have to check everything out on his end. I spent those days at work, trying to focus, but my mind was always drifting back to that house. I kept thinking, this could be it. This could finally be my home. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, hoping it was Pete with good news. One afternoon, while I was on my break at the warehouse, I finally got the call. Pete's voice was bright, and he said, "Steve, congratulations. The place is yours." I just stood there, holding my phone, not really believing it. I thanked him a bunch of times, and when I hung up, I felt this wave of relief wash over me. I did it. I actually did it. I drove over to the house later that day and just stood outside looking at it. It wasn't much, but it was mine. All the nights spent in my car, all the rough patches, felt like they had finally led to something. I had a place where I didn't have to worry about getting kicked out or moving every night. It was a real home. Moving in was another challenge, but this time, it was the kind of challenge I wanted. I had to clean up the place, get some basic furniture, and make it livable. I started with the essentials: a mattress, a small table, and a couple of chairs. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to get started. I spent my first night in the house sleeping on that mattress, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally relax. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into fixing the place up. I patched up the scuffed floors, painted the walls, and slowly started filling the space with things I'd collected over the years. It felt like every little improvement I made was a step toward reclaiming my life. It was my way of proving to myself that I wasn't just scraping by anymore. I was building something real. But of course, life has a way of dragging you back, no matter how far you think you've come. A few weeks after moving in, I made a mistake. I posted about the new place on social media. I guess I was feeling proud and wanted to share it, even if I hadn't talked to most of my family in ages. I posted a picture of me holding the keys in front of the door, captioned it with something like, "From living in my car to owning my first home, never give up." The response was huge. Friends, old coworkers, even some people I hadn't spoken to in years were leaving comments and congratulating me. It felt good to have that support. But then, of course, the past had to show up. One afternoon, I was unpacking a box of kitchen supplies when there was a knock on my door. I thought it might be a neighbor stopping by to say hello, but when I opened it, I was met with a familiar face. Dan, my older brother, standing there with his wife and kids. "Hey, Steve, saw your post. Nice place you got here," he said, stepping inside like he owned the place. His wife and kids followed, looking around like they were scoping the place out. I was caught off guard. "Dan, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice tight. Dan gave me this casual shrug like it was no big deal. "Well, since you've got all this space now and it's just you, we were thinking maybe we could move in. You wouldn't even notice us." I stood there, my hands tightening into fists. I was furious. "No, Dan, this is my home." That's when he pulled out some papers and waved them in front of me. "Look, we even drew up rental agreements. You can stay in your camper. It's what you're used to, right?" I felt my blood boil. The audacity. I snatched the papers and scanned them. They were fake. My signature wasn't even close. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady. "Get out of my house, Dan. Now." He didn't move, his expression shifting to something darker. "Come on, Steve, don't make this difficult. We're family." That's when I knew they weren't leaving on their own. I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. As I stood there, waiting for them to arrive, I felt this overwhelming sense of betrayal. My own brother, trying to take over my life again. When the cops showed up, they took one look at the papers and saw right through it. They told Dan and his family they had to leave, and they did. But not before giving me this look like I was the one in the wrong. As they drove off, I felt this mix of anger and relief. The house was mine, and no one was going to take that from me. That night, as I locked up the house, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I had finally taken back control of my life, and this time, I wasn't letting anyone drag me down. On my 16th birthday, parents drop a bombshell. You're moving in with your aunt, no questions asked. So, let me set the scene for you. I had just turned 16, and like any normal kid, I thought I might get a birthday cake, maybe a lame gift, something simple, right? Nope. What I got instead was a ticket out of my own house. Literally. My parents didn't even sugarcoat it. They told me, point blank, that they needed my room for the baby. My sister Carla, the golden child, is pregnant, and suddenly, I'm out of there. It wasn't like a discussion or anything. It was like a quick meeting with HR where they tell you you're fired. No emotions, no second thoughts. They just sat me down, looked me straight in the face, and said, "You're going to live with Aunt Lydia." I didn't even get a say. I couldn't believe it. It was my birthday, and they couldn't even wait until the next day to throw me out. Now, I've always known Carla was the favorite, okay? She's 22, expecting a baby, and for as long as I can remember, she's been the center of their world. But this? I mean, I wasn't expecting much for my birthday, but getting kicked out of my own room to make space for her unborn baby? Yeah, that's a new low. They didn't even try to soften the blow, no. "Hey, we know this is tough, but we love you," or anything like that. Just, "We need your room for the baby, pack your stuff." And I didn't get it at first, like, okay, fine, Carla's pregnant, but we have a guest room. Why can't they just turn that into the nursery? When I asked, they just kind of looked at each other, then finally came out with it. Matt needs a place to stay too. Matt, Carla's boyfriend. The guy's like 25 and has his own place. But somehow, my parents decided he needed to move into our house too. So yeah, the guest room went to him, and the baby, my room, and me, shipped off to Aunt Lydia's like an old piece of furniture no one wants anymore. I guess I could have fought harder, but what's the point? I've been dealing with this kind of crap my whole life. I've learned to expect nothing from them, because every time I've hoped for even the tiniest bit of love or attention, they let me down. This wasn't a surprise. It was just another reminder that to them, I'm always going to be second place to Carla. Always. The worst part? Carla didn't even bother showing up for this family meeting. I mean, yeah, I get it. She's pregnant and probably didn't want to deal with the awkwardness, but still. It's not like we ever had a super close relationship, but this? It felt like she was just too okay with me being booted out to make space for her new little family. Like, she couldn't even face me while our parents were basically kicking me out of my own home. When I went upstairs to pack, it didn't feel real. I mean, I'd spent my whole life in that room. Every crappy little birthday I'd had, every time I tried to avoid my parents' drama, I'd go up to that room and just zone out. And now, just like that, it wasn't mine anymore. I started throwing stuff into a suitcase, not even sure what I was packing. It felt weird, like I was moving out of my life, not just my room. And it wasn't like my parents helped or anything. They just watched, like they were waiting for me to hurry up so they could get on with their day. They offered to drive me to Aunt Lydia's like it was some kind of favor. I could have walked, honestly, but at this point, I was too tired to fight it. So I just let them drive me. The whole time in the car, they acted like we were on some normal trip. My mom was talking about dinner plans, like she hadn't just told her son he wasn't welcome in his own house anymore. When we finally pulled up to Aunt Lydia's, there was no emotional moment or anything. They didn't even pretend to care. Just a quick, "Here we are, see you later," before they drove off. Aunt Lydia, on the other hand, looked at me like I was some stray dog that had been left at her doorstep. Not in a bad way, more like she was about to take me in and give me the love I'd been missing out on my whole life. She hugged me as soon as I got out of the car. The difference between her and my parents was so obvious. She actually cared. I could feel it. She didn't even need to say anything, but when I told her what happened, she was furious. When I laid it all out for her, the birthday, the eviction, the baby room stuff, she couldn't believe it. I think at first she thought I was exaggerating, but once I told her the whole story, she got quiet, like she was processing the level of messed up that this situation was. Then, without saying a word to me, she grabbed her phone and walked into the other room. I couldn't hear much, but I knew she was on the phone with my dad because her voice went from calm to super angry in about 2 seconds flat. And that's not like Aunt Lydia at all. She's usually so chill, the type of person who never raises her voice. But whatever my dad said to her must have really pushed her buttons, because I've never heard her yell like that before. When she came back, Her face was still red, and she looked pissed. She sat down, took a deep breath, and told me what had gone down. Apparently, my dad had told her that I wanted to move out, that I was excited to stay with Aunt Lydia for a while, like I'd volunteered to give up my room for the baby. That's why Aunt Lydia didn't question anything when they asked if I could move in. She thought I was the one who wanted to leave. I just sat there, stunned. I mean, I always knew my parents weren't great, but this, lying to my own aunt to make themselves look better, that was a whole new level of low. Aunt Lydia apologized to me over and over again, saying she would have never agreed to it if she knew the truth. She said she couldn't believe my parents would treat me like that, and that I was welcome to stay with her for as long as I wanted. Honestly, I didn't even know what to say. It felt good to be somewhere where I wasn't treated like garbage for once, but at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about how messed up my parents were. They didn't even care about me enough to tell the truth. They just wanted me out of the way, and they didn't care how it happened. I went to bed that night in Aunt Lydia's spare room, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to walk on eggshells around anyone. I wasn't scared of what mood my mom or dad would be in or worried about Carla getting all the attention. It was peaceful. But there was this weird, empty feeling too, like I'd lost something important, even if that something wasn't that great to begin with. In the end, I guess getting kicked out wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to me. At least now I was with someone who actually gave a damn. But still, it hurt. Knowing that your own parents would rather lie and shove you out of the house than deal with you, that sticks with you. All right, so I'm living with Aunt Lydia now, and I gotta say, it feels weird. Not in a bad way, but it's just different, you know? I mean, I've lived my entire life under my parents' roof, even if it was a crappy situation most of the time. And now, here I am, in a house where someone actually wants me there. It's almost too much to handle. Aunt Lydia has been super welcoming, like, she's really trying to make sure I feel at home. The first couple of days, she went out of her way to make me feel comfortable, like making me breakfast, asking if I wanted to redecorate my room, stuff like that. It's nice, but honestly, it felt strange at first. I'm not used to anyone caring about what I want. I was so used to just fading into the background at home, and now suddenly here's someone paying attention to me. But I'll admit, it took me a while to get used to it. Like, the first morning after I moved in, I came downstairs and Aunt Lydia had made this huge breakfast. I'm talking pancakes, eggs, bacon, the whole deal. She smiled at me and said, "I thought you could use a good breakfast to start the day." And I just kind of stared at it, like I didn't even know what to do with it. At home, I was lucky if I got a piece of toast before I ran out the door for school. I sat down, ate a bit, and Lydia kept asking me about my plans for the day. And honestly, I didn't have any. I was just trying to wrap my head around everything. The whole moving out thing, my parents not even bothering to check on me, it was all still sinking in. I mean, yeah, I didn't want to live with them anymore, but it's still weird to think about how fast they were willing to throw me out. After breakfast, Aunt Lydia had to go to work, so I was left alone in the house. That was another thing that felt strange. I was just there. No one telling me what to do, no one hovering over me or ignoring me like my parents did. It was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to constantly be on edge, so I decided to make a post online about my story just to get it out. But then, that afternoon, things got interesting. I was just chilling on the couch, minding my own business, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. Now keep in mind, this was like 2 days after they'd kicked me out, and they hadn't said a word to me since. So I was kind of curious to see what she had to say. The text? "We need to talk. That's it. No, how are you doing? Or are you okay?" Just a cold, robotic, "we need to talk." Honestly, I wasn't sure if I should even bother responding, but curiosity got the best of me, so I replied, "About what?" What followed was a bunch of texts from my mom about how I embarrassed the family by posting online. Apparently, some of my extended family had seen the post, and it had caused a bit of a stir. But instead of asking if I was okay, or maybe realizing how much they'd screwed up, my mom was more concerned about how it made her look. She kept saying things like, "Do you realize how this reflects on us?" And, "You've made things difficult for your father and me." I couldn't believe it. I sat there, reading the texts, just getting angrier and angrier. They kicked me out on my birthday, lied to Aunt Lydia about it, and now I'm the bad guy for telling the truth. I was done with it. I didn't even bother replying after that. I just threw my phone on the couch and tried to distract myself by watching TV. Later that evening, Aunt Lydia came home, and she could tell something was up. I guess I wasn't doing a great job of hiding how pissed off I was. She sat down next to me and asked if I was okay, and at first I didn't want to burden her with all this. but she's got this way of making you feel like it's okay to talk, you know? So I told her about the texts from my mom, how they were more concerned about their reputation than what they'd actually done to me. Aunt Lydia didn't even flinch. She just nodded and said, "That sounds exactly like your parents." I laughed a little because, yeah, it was spot on. Then she said something that really hit me. "You don't owe them anything, you know. You're not responsible for their reputation or how they feel. You're allowed to be angry." And that's when it clicked. I was angry. I'd spent so long just accepting the way things were, letting them treat me like crap because I thought that's just how it was. But now, I was done. I didn't owe them anything. The next few days were a blur of emotions. I started blocking out my parents more and more. I didn't respond to their texts, didn't even look at them after a while. They weren't going to get to me anymore. Aunt Lydia helped me with that too. She didn't say much, but just having her around, knowing she had my back, made everything easier. But things weren't totally calm yet. A few days later, I was at school, just trying to get through the day, when I noticed my parents had shown up. Yep, they actually came to my school like that was going to fix anything. I saw them standing outside the gate, waving me over like nothing was wrong. My first instinct was to ignore them, but they were pretty loud, and my friends started noticing. I felt my heart pounding. Like I didn't want to deal with this drama in front of everyone. But my friends? They had my back. A few of them literally formed a circle around me, like they were some kind of human shield. It was kind of funny, but also super reassuring. I wasn't alone in this. Eventually, I had to go over and talk to them. I walked up, keeping a safe distance, and said, "What do you want?" My mom started going on about how I wasn't answering their calls or texts and how they were worried about me. I almost laughed. Now they were worried? After kicking me out and ignoring me for days? Then they dropped the real reason they were there. My grandparents, the ones with all the money, had found out about what they did to me, and now my parents were freaking out because they were scared of losing their inheritance. Yeah, that's what this was about. Not me. Not my well-being. Just money. They didn't care about fixing things with me. They just wanted to make sure they didn't lose their precious payday. I stood there staring at them, not even knowing what to say. It was like everything I'd always suspected was laid out in front of me. They didn't care about me. They never had. And now they were only trying to reel me back in because it benefited them, not me. I told them I wasn't coming home. Not now, not ever. And then I turned around and walked away. Their voices faded behind me as I rejoined my friends, who were all watching the whole thing go down. I don't know what my parents did after that. I didn't look back to find out. All I knew was I was done with them. Completely done. And for the first time, I felt free. When I got back to Aunt Lydia's that day, I told her everything. She wasn't surprised. She said something like, "It's always about money with them." And she was right. But you know what? It didn't matter anymore. I had Aunt Lydia, and I had people who actually cared about me. That's all I needed. Update 1. So, after the whole school confrontation with my parents, I thought maybe things would settle down. You know? Like they'd get the message that I wasn't coming back and we could all just move on. But of course, that would be way too simple for my life. A few days went by and I was feeling pretty good. Aunt Lydia was being her usual awesome self, making sure I was comfortable and all that. It was like the first time in forever that I wasn't constantly stressed or waiting for the next bad thing to happen. I'd even started to get into a routine: school, hanging out with my friends, coming back to Aunt Lydia's place, and just chilling. Things felt normal, or at least as normal as they could be after getting kicked out of your house. But then, the drama found its way back in, like it always does. It started with a message from Carla. I hadn't heard much from her since the whole eviction thing, other than that one text asking to talk, which I had pretty much ignored. But this time, she was blowing up my phone. Like, text after text. At first, I didn't even want to open them, but curiosity got the best of me. I mean, we were siblings. Maybe, just maybe, she was trying to make things right. Turns out, not really. Her text started off super casual, like she was trying to ease into something. "Hey, how are things at Aunt Lydia's? Hope you're doing okay?" Stuff like that. Then, out of nowhere, she drops this. "Mom and Dad are really upset. They think you're being unfair by not talking to them." Unfair? Really? I couldn't believe it. How was I the one being unfair here? I was the one who got kicked out. I was the one who got lied to. And now, somehow, I was the bad guy for not running back into their arms? I didn't reply right away. I needed to process it. I wasn't even angry at this point, more like exhausted. It was like every time I thought I'd escaped the drama, they found a new way to drag me back in. I was pacing around the living room trying to decide what to do when Aunt Lydia walked in. She took one look at me and knew something was up. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting down on the couch. I showed her the text from Carla and she just shook her head. "They're trying to guilt trip you. Classic." And yeah, she was right. My parents were pros at the guilt game, and it seemed like they'd roped Carla into it now. But what really got to me was the next part of Carla's message. She said, "You know, it's not too late to fix things. If you come home, we can all move past this. Mom and Dad are ready to talk." Move past this? Like what? Pretend it never happened? Go back to living in a house where I didn't matter? Where I was just the extra kid they barely tolerated? No thanks. Aunt Lydia must have seen how frustrated I was getting because she put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You don't owe them anything. You know that, right?" And that's when it hit me. I didn't owe them anything. I didn't need to fix things. I didn't need to go back to that toxic situation just to make them feel better. It was like this weight lifted off my chest, and I realized I could actually say no. I could choose not to go back. I grabbed my phone, ready to respond to Carla, but then I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? I didn't want to come off as harsh, but I also didn't want to let her think I was caving to their guilt trip. So I kept it simple. "I'm not coming back. I'm happy here." I hit send and waited. And waited. She didn't reply right away, which was honestly a relief. I was tired of the back and forth. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but no. Not even close. A few hours later, my phone buzzes again. This time, it's my mom. She sent this long message about how I was tearing the family apart and how I needed to come home to make things right. It was filled with all this guilt-heavy language about family bonds and forgiveness, like I was the one who needed to apologize. I couldn't believe it. My mom was actually trying to make me feel bad for standing up for myself. She went on and on about how it was time to let go of the past and move forward together. But all I could think about was how they never once took responsibility for what they did. They never said sorry for kicking me out, never admitted they were wrong. All they cared about was making it look like everything was fine again. I was about to respond when Aunt Lydia chimed in again. "Do you really need to reply to that?" And she was right. I didn't. What was the point? It wasn't like anything I said was going to change their minds. They weren't looking for an actual conversation. They just wanted me to fall back in line. So I didn't reply. I blocked my mom's number. I know it sounds harsh, but I was done playing their game. I was done letting them mess with my head. The next day at school, I felt weirdly free. Like I'd finally broken away from all the nonsense. My friends were supportive too. They knew what was going on and kept checking in on me, making sure I was okay. It was nice having people around who actually cared. But of course, my parents weren't done. Later that week, Aunt Lydia got a call from them. I wasn't in the room, but I could hear bits and pieces. My dad was talking about family responsibilities and being mature, which was pretty ironic coming from the guy who literally kicked his kid out to make space for his grandkid. When Aunt Lydia hung up, she looked at me and said, "They're still trying to get you to come home, but don't worry, I shut it down." She told them straight up that I wasn't going back and that they needed to stop pushing me. She even threatened to get a lawyer involved if they kept harassing me, which I didn't even know she could do. But apparently she was serious about it, and honestly, that made me feel safer than I had in a long time. So, that's where things stand now. My parents have gone radio silent since Aunt Lydia's threat, and I haven't heard a peep from Carla either. It's been quiet, almost too quiet, but I'm not complaining. For once, I feel like I have control over my life, and that's something I never thought I'd have. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe my parents will give up and leave me alone, or maybe they'll keep trying to guilt trip me into coming back. But either way, I'm not going back. I've got Aunt Lydia, I've got my friends, and I've got a life that doesn't revolve around being ignored or mistreated. And for the first time, I'm okay with that. Update 2. So after all the drama with my parents trying to guilt trip me into coming home, things finally started to calm down a bit. Or at least I thought they did. I mean, it had been quiet for a while, too quiet. My parents went radio silent after Aunt Lydia's warning, and I hadn't heard from Carla since I told her I wasn't coming back. For a minute, I actually thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd backed off for good. But of course, nothing stays calm for long in my life. One evening, Aunt Lydia and I were just hanging out in the living room watching TV. It was one of those rare moments where I felt, I don't know, peaceful. Like everything was normal, or at least as close to normal as it gets. I wasn't thinking about my parents, school, or any of the usual crap. It was just me and Aunt Lydia watching some mindless show, and I was actually relaxed. Then my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first. I didn't want to ruin the moment, but it kept buzzing. over and over. Finally, I grabbed it and saw it was Carla. Again. At first, I thought it was going to be more of the same. Her telling me how unfair I was being, how I needed to talk to mom and dad, blah, blah, blah. But this time, the texts were different. She wasn't mad. She wasn't trying to guilt trip me. Instead, she was apologizing, like full on apologizing. I'm sorry for everything, she wrote. I should have stood up for you. I stared at the screen, not sure how to react. I mean, after everything, why now? Why was she suddenly sorry? Then she kept going. I didn't know they were going to kick you out. They told me you wanted to leave. I didn't think it would go this far. Now, that threw me off. I knew my parents lied about a lot of things, but I had no idea they'd lied to her too. Carla kept texting, explaining that our parents had spun some story about how I wanted to move in with Aunt Lydia, that I was totally on board with the whole thing. And she believed them. She even told me that she thought I was being selfish by not helping with the baby, which is why she didn't fight back when they kicked me out. She didn't realize how bad it actually was for me until she saw the stuff I posted online. It was a lot to take in. Aunt Lydia must have noticed the look on my face because she paused the show and asked, "What's going on?" I handed her the phone, not really sure what to say. She read through the texts, her face going from curious to a little surprised. "Well, that's something," she said, handing the phone back to me. "What are you going to do?" And honestly, I didn't know. Part of me was still angry at Carla, even though I could see that she'd been lied to just like I had. But another part of me, well, I felt bad for her. She was in a messed up situation too, dealing with all the pressure from our parents, the pregnancy, the lies. Maybe she wasn't the bad guy I thought she was. So, I texted her back. I didn't jump right into forgiveness or anything, but I told her I appreciated the apology. I said I needed time to process everything, but that I wasn't mad at her anymore. That felt like the right thing to say, honest but not too harsh. Then Carla hit me with another bomb. She told me she was planning to move in with Matt, her boyfriend, and that she didn't want to live with mom and dad anymore either. Apparently, things had been getting really tense at home since I left, and she was feeling trapped. She said, "They're trying to control everything, and I can't take it anymore." That made me pause. For so long, I thought Carla was the golden child, the one who always got everything she wanted from our parents. But now, hearing her side of things, it sounded like she was just as much a victim of their control as I was. It was weird. Like I'd been seeing everything through this one lens, and now that lens was cracking, and the truth was a whole lot messier than I thought. She kept texting, saying how she felt bad for not standing up for me sooner, how she wished she'd done something before it got to this point. And for the first time, I felt like maybe we were on the same page. Maybe we weren't enemies after all. That night, I didn't sleep much. I just kept thinking about everything, about how messed up our family really was. It wasn't just me versus them anymore. Carla had her own struggles, and even though she'd let me down before, she was trying to make things right now. That had to count for something, right? The next day, I decided to meet up with Carla. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but I figured we needed to talk face to face, not just over text. We agreed to meet at this cafe downtown Neutral Territory, so it wouldn't feel like either of us had the upper hand. When I got there, she was already sitting at a table by the window, looking nervous. That was weird to see too, Carla, the confident one, actually looking anxious. I sat down, and for a few seconds, we just kind of stared at each other, not really knowing how to start. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm really sorry," she said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't know how bad it was for you. I was so wrapped up in my own stuff I didn't even notice." I nodded, not really sure what to say yet. It was hard to be mad at her when she was sitting there, looking genuinely sorry. I didn't know they were going to do that to you," she continued. "And when I found out, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix it." There it was. That guilt I knew she'd been carrying around. And maybe that was what I needed to hear. That she did feel guilty. That she knew she'd messed up. "I'm not mad at you anymore," I finally said. "I get it. They lied to you too. But I'm not coming back home, Carla. I can't." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I wouldn't expect you to. I'm leaving too. I can't live with them anymore. They're trying to control everything about the baby, about Matt and me. I just can't do it." We sat there for a while talking about everything, about our parents, about how things had gotten so bad, about what we were both going to do next. It was strange, but in a way it felt like we were finally on the same side. For the first time, I felt like Carla actually understood me. When we finally left the cafe, I didn't feel completely at peace, but I felt like we'd taken a step in the right direction. Things weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. For now, I was just glad that Carla and I were talking again, and that maybe, just maybe, we could start to fix what was broken. That night, when I got back to Aunt Lydia's, I told her everything that had happened. She smiled, nodded, and said, "Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom for people to see things clearly." And maybe she was right. Maybe Carla and I had both hit that point, but at least now we were climbing out of it together. Update 3. So after that meetup with Carla, things got, well, complicated, but also kind of clearer at the same time, if that makes any sense. I thought maybe after talking things through with her, we could just move on, go our separate ways, and leave all the family drama behind us. But, of course, that's not how life works, especially not in my family. A few days after I met Carla, Aunt Lydia and I were having one of our usual chill evenings. We just finished dinner, and I was getting ready to head up to my room when there was a knock at the door. Now, this doesn't sound like a big deal, but Aunt Lydia never has visitors at night. Like, ever. She's a quiet person, and her friends usually drop by during the day. So both of us were a little thrown off by the timing. Aunt Lydia looked at me with this puzzled expression like, "You expecting someone?" I shook my head, and we both walked to the door. She opened it, and, surprise, there stood my parents. I could feel my heart sink. Like, really? After everything, they had the nerve to show up here unannounced and try to get me back into their mess? I thought they'd given up after Aunt Lydia's threat to get legal involved. But nope, here they were, standing on her porch like nothing had happened. My mom had that fake concerned look on her face that she always pulls out when she's trying to manipulate me. My dad just stood behind her, looking awkward, like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Can we come in?" my mom asked, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Aunt Lydia didn't even look at me before saying, "No, I don't think that's a good idea." I almost smiled at that. Aunt Lydia doesn't play around when it comes to setting boundaries. My mom's face dropped, and she sighed like she was the victim in all this. "We just want to talk to you, honey. Please." I wasn't having it. I'd been through enough, and I wasn't about to let them drag me back into their drama just because they suddenly decided they wanted to talk. I folded my arms and leaned against the doorframe, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's there to talk about? You kicked me out. You lied to Aunt Lydia. And now you just show up like everything's fine?" My mom's eyes got wide, and she stammered, "It wasn't like that. We thought it was best for everyone." Best for everyone? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You thought it was best to kick me out on my birthday because Carla's pregnant? Seriously?" My dad finally chimed in, his voice quiet. "We didn't handle things well, okay? But you need to come home." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Why? So you can keep pretending like I don't exist while you bend over backward for Carla and the baby? No thanks." Aunt Lydia, sensing things were getting heated, stepped in. "Look, I think it's best if you two leave. He's made it clear he's not coming back." My mom wasn't giving up that easily, though. She started tearing up, the classic guilt trip move she always used when things didn't go her way. "We're your parents. We love you. We want to fix things." But here's the thing. I'd finally realized something. They didn't want to fix things for me. They wanted to fix things for them. They wanted to sweep everything under the rug, make it seem like we were one big happy family again. Also, they wouldn't have to deal with the fallout of their actions. But I wasn't playing along anymore. "You had plenty of chances to fix things," I said, my voice low but firm. "But every time you chose Carla. You chose her over me over and over again. So don't stand here and act like you care now." The silence that followed was heavy. My mom just stared at me, the tears still in her eyes, but this time, I wasn't falling for it. I wasn't going to be guilted into going back to a house where I was nothing more than an afterthought. My dad looked like he wanted to say something, but instead he just sighed and put a hand on my mom's shoulder. "Let's go," he muttered. My mom looked like she wanted to protest, but after a few seconds she turned and walked back to the car. Her shoulders slumped. My dad followed her without another word. Aunt Lydia closed the door, locking it behind them, and turned to me. "You okay?" I nodded. But the truth was, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was relieved. It felt like I'd finally stood up for myself, for real this time. But another part of me felt, I don't know, sad. Like no matter what I said, no matter how much I tried to cut them off, they were still my parents. And it sucked knowing they were always going to choose Carla over me. But that's the thing, isn't it? Family doesn't always mean what we want it to mean. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the worst. And that's a hard pill to swallow. Later that night, I got a text from Carla. She said our parents had told her about what happened and that she was sorry they had tried to force me back. She wasn't on their side this time, though. She said she understood why I didn't want to come home and that she was moving in with Matt, like she'd told me before. She ended the text with, "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." And you know what? That hit different. Coming from Carla, the one person I'd always thought was part of the problem, hearing her say that made me realize I wasn't alone in this. Maybe we weren't as close as some siblings, but we were starting to get there. I showed the text to Aunt Lydia, and she smiled. "You've come a long way, you know that?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool. But deep down, I knew she was right. I wasn't the same kid who'd been kicked out on his birthday. I'd learned to stand up for myself, to choose what was best for me, and not just go along with what other people wanted. The next morning, I woke up to a quiet house, sunlight streaming in through the windows, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. No more pretending, no more walking on eggshells, just me, in a place where I was wanted. And that felt pretty damn good.